Apache warriors don't ride into your canyon at sundown asking for water unless the drought has turned them desperate or furious. The words settled like hot coals on Jeb McAllister's tongue as he squinted down the twisting ravine. The girl knelt by the creek's last puddle, cupped hands trembling against cracked lips. The sun hovered just above the mesa rim, gilding her braid in ember light. Jeb's heart clenched. He knew the power of water in this land, and the wrath of those denied it. But let's go back to where it all began. 2 days earlier, Jeb McAllister had risen before dawn, saddle creaking beneath him as he rode the length of his canyon ranch. The arid wind carried the promise of another sun-scorched day. His herd grazed on parched grass, and the wooden troughs lay bone-dry. He'd spent the morning sparing his last canteens for the cattle, forcing his hired hand, Will Hayes, to carry a single jug for himself. By midday, Jeb's throat burned like desert sandpaper. He paused at the old stone cistern, half collapsed, choked with tumbleweed, and pried at the rotted cover. Nothing but dust and discarded bones met his lantern's glow. He sank to his knees, fist clenched on his breast. Drought had already broken half the territory. Soon it would break him. Late afternoon, Jeb walked the bluff above the creek, where silver willows bowed over the dwindling watercourse. He searched for hidden seeps, any sign of flow, but the streambed lay silent under cracked clay. He straightened at the echo of hoofbeats on stone behind him. A lone horse, rider bent low, dust curling like smoke. Jeb tensed, hand drifting to his colt, until the rider reined in and a young girl slid from the saddle. She was no more than 14, skin the color of sun-baked earth, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. Her braid, trimmed with feathers, draped over one shoulder. She held a gourd carved from a calabash, its rim chipped. She approached the creek edge without a word, dipped her gourd, and drank. Each swallow was a plea. Jeb cleared his throat. "You shouldn't be here," he said, voice steady despite the tremor in his gut. The girl looked up, wide-eyed, gourd resting in her lap. She spoke in soft tones, Navajo, Jicarilla, or Apache, Jeb couldn't tell. But the single word he recognized, water. He dismounted, unholstering his pistol but studying her bare feet. "This water's for my stock," he said. "I can't share." She dipped the gourd again. "Water now," she murmured, voice cracked from fever or fear. She lifted the gourd toward him, eyes pleading. Jeb hesitated. The sky was a furnace above them, and the creek was all she had. He thumbed his pistol back into its holster. "You ride hard to carry that girl here," he said, nodding toward her horse. "Your clan, are they near?" She shook her head, shoulders slumped. "My father," she said haltingly. "War chief." She paused, searching his face. "If no water, by dusk he comes." Jeb swallowed hard. Apache war chiefs were as relentless as the desert sun. He'd heard tales of whole villages uprooted, vindictive raids carried out over a stolen horse or insult. Denying water to one of their own invited vengeance. He squatted beside her, hand brushing the creek's surface. "There's enough for both," he said quietly. "But you must promise me you'll leave before sundown." The girl's eyes glimmered with relief. She nodded, gourd raised again. Jeb filled his cap and offered it. She drank her fill, then passed it back. He poured water onto his dry lips, tasting grit and mercy. She stood, shoulders squared in sudden courage. She tilted her head toward the low mesa where he kept his barn and well. "Where?" Jeb pointed to the canyon's mouth. "Follow the footpath. Keep your eyes on the sun." He reached into his coat and handed her 2 canteens. "Fill them. Leave at once." The girl folded the gourd into her pack, clasped the canteens, and hesitated. "Thank you," she whispered in Apache. Then she melted into the shadows, horses' hoofbeats fading down the rocky trail. Jeb watched her go, throat tight. He kicked a pebble into the dry creek bed and stood. The sky had darkened to molten gold. He glanced at his watch, a family heirloom, always 5 minutes slow. Sundown was near. He mounted and cantered toward his barn, mind racing. By dusk, he would face an army. his neighbor's men in sleepless vigil, his hired hand anxious at his side, and beyond them, the lethal promise of a war chief and 60 braves riding for blood or bargaining. Jeb spurred his mount, chest burning with responsibility and dread, as the wind rattled the willows overhead, whispering of the storm to come. By late afternoon, the sun had burned off the worst of its fury, but the canyon still broiled. Jeb McAllister led his sorrel mare into the dusty corral, the wooden rails hot beneath his gloved hand. Behind him, Will Hayes, his hired hand, shifted uneasily. Word had spread through the valley. A lone Apache girl had come begging for water at the creek, and Jeb had given it. Now rumors swirled like dust devils about his defiance of frontier custom, and the price it might exact. Will spat onto the dry ground. "You crossed a line, boss. Folks round here say you don't share water with redskins. Next they'll take your land as well." Jeb met Will's gaze, eyes narrowed against the glare. "I couldn't watch a child die of thirst." His voice was soft, but firm as the oaks lining the creek bottom. He unbuckled his Colt, checked its action, then holstered it. "This is my land, and I answer how I see fit." Will tugged at his coat. "The McAllister men don't bow to Apache threats. We've got neighbors backing if it comes to blood." Jeb nodded once. "Then we'll face what comes." He swung onto the saddle and turned toward the house. "Send word to Thaddeus Holt. Have him bring lanterns and pitchforks. If her clan rides in force, we'll show them no rusted fences and empty troughs live here." Will hesitated. "Holt's kids are young, boss, and his wife's with child. They ain't soldiers." Jeb's jaw clenched. "Then get help where you can." He guided Ember toward the well house, boots clicking on the planks. "I'm not sending a girl to die because of fear." Inside, he filled 2 more canteens at the well's fresh spring water, sealed them tight, and slung them over his saddlehorn. He paused at the porch, scanning the horizon where mesas dipped into gilded shadow. Dust trails wove like fingers across the flats. 3 or 4 riders approaching, perhaps scouts from the Apache band. Jeb's pulse drummed. He breathed deep and stepped inside to gather what provisions he could spare. At supper that night, Mrs. McAllister laid out corn pone and venison stew. Her face, lined by sun and worry, was pale beneath the lamplight. "Jeb," she said quietly, placing a ladle before him, "they're talking in town, saying you've invited a war party to your doorstep." He didn't look up from his plate. She was a child. She needed water. Mrs. McAllister's hand trembled as she passed him the bread. "I know, but they don't see it that way. Some believe you've broken the old ways, risked everything. Your kin? They'll want vengeance for any insult to Apache dignity." He set down his spoon, the stew cooling in its bowl. "When have decency ever been an insult?" His voice cracked with fatigue. "I'm tired of feeding prejudice more than cattle." Mrs. McAllister rose and poured his coffee, hands steadying with purpose. "Promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you'll think of Will and me, of this home." He met her eyes, saw the love and fear woven in their depths. He drew a deep breath. "I'll do what I must, but I won't abandon what's right." After supper, Jeb rode toward the creek under a moonless sky, lanterns bobbing as Holt and a handful of neighbors fanned out along the bank. Their faces were set, dark with uncertainty and resolve. Jeb dismounted, handed a lantern to Thaddeus Holt, and pointed to the creek's edge. "There," he whispered. "She took water here. Follow her tracks up the trail." The men moved in silence, eyes straining for hoofprints or footprints. Will hovered at Jeb's shoulder, hand on his revolver. They found the girl's path, imprints pressed into the damp sand, and followed it into the narrow gorge. There, in the hush before midnight, they saw her. The Apache girl kneeling beside a hidden seep, canteens full, her braid draped across her shoulder. At her side lay a small bundle of blankets and moccasins, signs of intent to travel far and fast. She looked up, startled, reaching for her gourd, but Jeb called softly. "Easy," he said. "I'm not here to harm you." She rose, slender and wary, eyes shining in the lantern glow. She spoke in Apache, voice melodic and urgent. A murmur ran through the men. Some felt shame, others anger. Thaddeus Holt stepped forward, voice gruff. "She's trespassed on private land," he growled. "Stolen waters still theft by Apache or Anglo." Jeb raised a hand. "She's no thief." He knelt beside the girl, placing a canteen in her hands. "Drink more if you must, but you go at first light. You give her water, and she spares my home." One man spat, but Jeb placed his hand on the man's arm. "You understand what she faces now, her father, his warriors, riding with hundreds if he deems it necessary. This is mercy, not weakness." The girl's lips quivered. Tears glistened as she tilted the canteen's rim to her mouth. Jeb watched the water spill over her knuckles, heard her throat swallowing relief. When she finally looked up, she met Jeb's gaze, nodding once, fiercely. Around them, the men shifted, grudging respect in their stance, fear edged with wonder. They saw mercy in action, justice that broke no law but the law of hardened hearts. Thaddeus Holt lowered his head, eyes cast to the creek. Will exhaled, tension leaving his shoulders. Jeb stood, hands on his hips. "At dawn, she leaves. We've done what we can." The men nodded and melted back into the shadows, lanterns bobbing out until only Jeb, Will, and the girl remained. Ember whinnied softly from the porch where Jeb had tethered her saddle. The girl whispered, voice trembling, "Thank you." Jeb offered his hand to help her mount. "Go with the water, and with my promise." He spoke gently. "Tell your father I gave you his child's drink freely, and tell him I stand by my choice." She placed the gourd in her sash, took his hand, and climbed onto her horse. Jeb handed her a canteen and watched as she rode off into the black ribbon of night, her silhouette swallowed by the gorge. Behind him, the creek glinted like a silver thread, leading back to life. Will touched Jeb's arm. "You did right." Jeb nodded, gaze lingering on the dark trail. "We did what needed doing." He holstered his lamp and led Ember back to the house. The night air held a sharp promise. At dusk, peace, or a war riding hard. And when dawn broke, he would know whether mercy had saved his home, or stirred a storm beyond reckoning. The first riders came as the sun dipped behind the western bluff, their silhouettes spiking the rim like jagged teeth against the dying light. Jeb McAllister stood on his porch, fingers curled around the rail, heart hollow with dread. Will Hayes reloaded at his hip, eyes darting to the narrow canyon mouth where 30 warriors advanced in single file, dust plumes pricking the air. Behind them rose 40 more, spears glinting, faces painted, horses snorting steam in the cooling air. A distant drumbeat pulsed through the gorge, slow and measured, each thump a summons. Jeb felt it in his chest, ancient and inexorable. He straightened his shoulders, masking the tremor in his limbs. "They ride for blood," he murmured. Will swallowed. 60 strong. "That can't be just for water." Jeb shook his head. "No, it's for honor." He stepped down from the porch, boot heels striking the boards with brittle resolve. Behind him, lantern light winked from windows, casting long shadows that quivered like ghosts. At the corral gate, the Apache lines halted. A lone rider stepped forward, the girl's father. His war bonnet feathers flickered in the breeze. His lance, tipped with eagle plume, caught the last rays of sun. Beneath the bonnet, sorrow and rage warred in his gaze. He raised one hand, palm outward, the sign of parley. Jeb removed his hat, wiping his brow. He walked down the range, spurs clicking against stone. Will followed, revolver slung but unraised. As he passed the barn, a 10-gallon hat caught his eye, folded carefully on the rail. A silent offering of peace from Mrs. McAllister, no words needed. Only the drum pressed on. Horse hooves rasped against the earth. 600 hooves, counting the return riders circling behind. The tempo quickened, and the warriors edged closer, the canyon walls echoing each step. 10 paces, Jeb halted. Will crouched behind him, every nerve alight. The war chief dismounted, long legs folding easily to earth. He strode forward with arrows at his back, voice rising in the Apache tongue. The beat of his war drum matched the pulse in Jeb's temples. Jeb swallowed. "I gave her water," he said, voice firm but not loud enough to carry. "Because she had none. I could not let her die of thirst." The chief's eyes narrowed, examining every line on Jeb's sunburned face, every scar, markers of battles fought and promises broken. He glanced at the girl, now arrayed behind Jeb, silenced by fear but standing tall in borrowed courage. Jeb's breath caught at the sight of her, 13 years old, yet bearing the weight of inheritance in each careful movement. The drumbeat eased into a rumble like distant thunder. Another counselor rode forward, gesturing to the water-filled troughs behind Jeb's house, brimming from the ranch's well. The chief's gaze flicked to them, then back to Jeb's. Above the whisper of wind, the creek's faint gurgle seemed to answer. Jeb raised his hand. "There's water for your people beyond these gates, enough to fill every skin and every barrel." The chief's head tilted, curiosity tempered by ancient custom. He swept his arm toward the canyon's mouth, then toward the ranch. The warriors shifted, tension coiling like rattlesnake before a strike. Will stepped forward, voice tight with urgency. "They'll share your water. Just tell them where to find it." The chief's gaze pierced Will and returned to Jeb. He lifted one eyebrow, a single arch that carried centuries of protocol. Jeb felt the weight of that look, a challenge and an invitation all at once. Thunder rolled through the gorge, hooded clouds thundering overhead, though no rain fell yet. The air shimmered with electric promise. Warriors on the ridge began to drum faster, war paint glittering like starlight on hides. Jeb felt the ground pulse beneath him, tremors of legacy and revenge converging on this moment. The chief closed his eyes, inhaling the scent of rain and dust. Then he spoke a single word in Apache. "Water." It was not a question but a decree. The girl, tears glinting under torchlight, nodded and stepped forward to fill a gourd from a trough. She offered it to her father, who tasted the water and pronounced it pure. A murmur swept the ranks. Relief, wonder, grudging respect. The chief snapped his fingers and signaled his riders. They moved past Jeb and Will in silent procession. Each man bowed briefly, water gourds in hand, before sloping off toward the barn's troughs. Jeb exhaled, the tension easing enough that his shoulders sagged. Will wiped sweat from his brow, eyes never leaving the canyon's mouth. All 60 rode past, hooves stirring up motes of hope and caution. Then the chief returned, dismounting before Jeb once more. He retrieved a single quill from his headdress and handed it to Jeb, a token of truce and gratitude. Jeb looked at the quill, its ivory shaft carved with fine Apache script. He bowed and touched his heart, then extended his fist in respect. The chief tapped Jeb's fist in return, then raised his open palm in farewell. The war drum stilled, replaced by the creek's gentle murmur and the night wind sighing through willows. Jeb watched the riders file away, 60 strong, carrying water gourds and the quiet dignity of a people who had come seeking sustenance, and left recognizing an ally. The gourd girl lingered behind her father, meeting Jeb's gaze with a shy smile of gratitude. As the last warrior disappeared into the twilight, the sky cracked open with distant lightning, the storm finally breaking. Rain pattered on the barn roof, washing dust and silence away. On the porch, Jeb and Will stood unmoving, lanterns guttering in the first drops. Jeb tipped his hat toward the canyon mouth. "They've ridden for justice," he said quietly, "and found mercy." Will nodded, voice hushed. "We'll keep the troughs full." The drumbeat had ended, but its echo lingered in every raindrop. Reminder that in this lawless land, true courage was measured not by gunpowder, but by water and the choices we make when others most need mercy. As dawn broke over McAllister Canyon, a gentle hush settled in place of last night's drums and thunder. The storm had washed the red dust clean from fence rails and hoofprints alike, leaving the ranch's troughs brimming and the creek's swollen banks shining in the early light. Jeb McAllister stood at the corral gate, his boots sinking into the soft, damp earth. Ember nickered softly, tail flicking as she pawed the ground. Behind him, Will Hayes stepped into the clearing, carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. He offered one to Jeb, who accepted it with a nod. Neither spoke at first. Their silence was a mutual acknowledgement of what had passed. 60 Apache warriors riding for blood, and yet departing in peace. At the edge of the barnyard, the Apache war chief knelt beside his daughter, smoothing the folds of her blanket. The girl, eyes bright with relief, held a canteen now nearly empty, as though reluctant to let go of the last drops. The chief pressed a hand to his daughter's shoulder, then rose and walked toward Jeb, his gait steady beneath the weight of yesterday's honor upheld. The 2 men met at a distance of a dozen paces. The chief lifted his hand in greeting, quill still tucked in its ivory sheath, and Jeb returned the gesture with hat in hand. Behind them, the ranch buildings and the distant mesas made the world feel both vast and intimately small, a frontier held together by fragile bonds of trust. Softly, the chief spoke in Apache. Jeb caught the final words. "Bas, gratitude, and Big Ida friend." He bowed his head, voice low. "Water and mercy," he translated. "May they guide our paths." Will tended ember, ears flicked forward, alert but relaxed in the companionship of 2 peoples bound by this morning's peace. The chief smiled briefly, then turned toward his daughter. He offered Jeb a single woven bracelet, turquoise beads strung on sinew, an offering of friendship. Jeb slipped it onto his wrist, the cool stones pressing against sun-scarred skin. In return, Jeb reached into his coat and brought out a small iron horseshoe nail, burnished to a dull sheen. He handed it to the chief. "For luck on your journeys," Jeb said. The chief accepted it, holding the nail reverently before tucking it into his sash. At the girl's soft urging, he mounted his horse and called his warriors. One by one, the riders emerged from the fog, faces stoic, spears at rest. They formed 2 lines flanking their chief. The girl sat proudly beside him, water canteens strapped at her side, eyes sweeping the ranch that had given her life. Jeb watched them mount, heart swelling with an unfamiliar warmth. "Tell your people this canyon welcomes them," he said, voice catching. "Tell them there are always open troughs here." The chief dipped his lance in a salute. The riders stamped their mounts, hooves sinking in damp ground. Then, with a single silent nod, they swung their horses' heads toward the creek. The girl raised her hand in farewell, braid dancing like a banner in the morning breeze. Jeb and Will stood together as 60 riders faded into the misty dawn, dust rising anew where horses had trod. Will exhaled, shoulder sagging. "That was more than I ever thought a canteen of water could buy." Jeb poured the last of his coffee onto the soil, a libation for the land. "It wasn't just water," he said. "It was a promise." He turned toward the barn, his boots leaving prints in the soft earth. "Come on. We've got fence rails to mend and fields to tend. The work never ends." They walked side by side, the turquoise bracelet glinting on Jeb's wrist. Ember followed, ears forward, sensing the peace that lay in every corner of the ranch. The skies overhead were clearing, and the air smelled of sage and new beginnings. By midday, Jeb and Will had repaired the broken hinge on the barn door, patched the leaky trough, and smoothed the boot tracks into the soft corral soil. Each task felt lighter now, no longer merely chores, but acts of stewardship for a land they shared with neighbors of all stripes. That evening, as the sun sank behind the western mesas, Mrs. McAllister called them to supper. Venison stew with wild onions and flatbread baked in the hearth's embers. She served the meal in heavy pottery bowls, the aroma rich with herbs and gratitude. At the table's head sat Jeb, his wristband of turquoise catching the dying light. Will raised his bowl in a silent toast. Jeb met his gaze, sharing a quiet smile. No words were needed. The feast itself was testament to their triumph. How one girl's thirst had drawn 60 riders through death's shadow and back again, forging an alliance neither expected. Later, under a sky staring into night's depths, Jeb stepped onto the porch alone. The land breathed around him, the creek's lullaby, the hush of cottonwood leaves, the distant howl of a lone coyote. He closed his eyes, remembering the girl's trembling hands cupping water, the chief's measured drumbeat, the legion of riders parting like river currents. In that stillness, Jeb felt the truest measure of the frontier, not the roar of gunfire, but the shared heartbeats that echoed in kindness. He removed the turquoise bracelet and held it between his fingers. Across the canyon, a breeze carried the faint scent of sage and cedar, a whisper of gratitude carried on the wind. He slipped the bracelet onto his daughter's laundry line, hanging it among her ribbons and quilts. It would dry there, a token of a promise kept and a friendship born where water flows. And when dawn came again, anyone who walked the canyon path would see those turquoise beads dancing in the breeze. A reminder that in the harshest places, compassion still finds a way to bloom.